Wonderful. So, thank you once again for coming to our book group here at Canterbury Cathedral. So, we're looking tonight, as I say, at the second dwelling place of the interior castle by St. Teresa of Avila. But I thought what might be useful is to actually have a little think about her life. Last week I talked a bit about her book, what kind of book we were reading, but I thought this week I'd talk a little bit about her life so that we got an idea of who she was, but also what I found really interesting was how writing actually helped her to understand her own experiences. And I think those of you who've been in this book group right from the beginning will know that actually we've said that a number of times that people write to understand what they have experienced about God, because it's not always easy to articulate. Um, yeah, it's not always easy to articulate our inner stirrings, our inner spiritual life. Someone's just asked where are the questions to ponder posted. They are actually on our website. If you go to our events, there are a lot of events happening here at Canterbury Cathedral, but if you just scroll them down, then you'll actually be able to see them. But don't worry, because I will actually put them up.
They
In
were
the
in the
chat.
email on it as well.
Pardon?
They were in the email that we got today.
You've got them, have you?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. That's good. So hopefully other people will be able to find them. Thank you, Iris. That's really helpful. Okay, so let's have a think of her life. So the main source for understanding Teresa's life actually comes from her own autobiography, which came about as a result of her attempts, as I say, to try and describe and explain her spiritual life. Now, the reason she had to do this was because a number of her confessors and directors were really suspicious of what she was describing that was happening in her spiritual life. They were not the ordinary, and I suspect they thought she was a slightly, I don't know, paranoid sort of woman, who wasn't really down to earth enough. And so she had a real difficulty with spiritual directors to to find someone who would actually help her in the spiritual path. She did in the end, but her writing was to try and explain this. So the work was composed in its first form in 1562. So that's actually quite a long way into her life, kind of later stages of her life. And as a result of writing this autobiography, it actually grew a number of people to her who were fascinated by that time, by her personality and also by her writings. So just let Nancy in. So what's interesting then is when you actually turn to the life of Teresa of Avila, I've got a copy of it here, and actually it's still produced by Penguin, which is amazing, amazing. Then it's a real combination of not only her history, but also of the history of her inner life, which is really interesting because not everybody is able to do that. I guess another person who was really good at doing that was Marjorie Kemp. She was one of those people who, gave us the external, what was happening in her life, but also gave us this internal world, which is really helpful. But right at the beginning of the book, she tells us very helpfully that she's born in Avila in Spain on the 28th of March, 1515. And she had a very religious father, Don Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, I think is how you pronounce it. Um, but she was the child of his second wife, Donna Beatrix, and one of 10 children, which was remarkable, 10 children. When Teresa was aged 12, sadly, her mother died. But there's this lovely story that she tells about, which gives us an inkling into just how what a forceful character she must have been, because she tells us about, this fervor for, religious piety that she had, and that her and her brother, after reading stories about the martyrs, decided to go off and become martyrs themselves. And they literally ran out of the house, um, in this really enormous sort of act of faith, but a passionate kind of response that you often see, I guess, in children to what she was reading and to her faith as well. So just after her mother died, so she would have been about 14 years old, she's placed in a convent that was run by Augustinian nuns for girls of nobility. And here she was very influenced by one of the sisters and began to feel that call to the religious life. But her father was really unwilling to let her go, really. And I think probably had that father-daughter strength of bond. And so she actually, a bit like running off to be a martyr, she fled to become a Carmelite. And on the 2nd of November, 1535, that's when she left home and entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation in Avila. And we get the sense from her book that this was not an easy separation for the father or actually for Teresa herself. However, 2 years later, he obviously had agreed to her becoming a Carmelite nun, and she made her profession. In the autumn then of 1538, Teresa became seriously ill and she nearly died. And as we hear from the prologue to her interior castle, and throughout the text that we're reading, ill health and acute suffering was something that really remained part of her life from that time onwards. And someone who suffers from chronic pain, I can really relate to that sort of living with something that actually can be quite debilitating. So it's remarkable, given that that she actually managed to do all that she did in her life. So while she was ill, this is a bit like Ignatius of Loyola. When he was very ill, he really had this kind of transformation in his inner life. So in the same way, Teresa, while she was ill, she read St. Gregory's Morals, and also a text written by a Franciscan, de Osuna, which was called the Third Spiritual Alphabet. And Teresa tells us all about this spiritual development and actually what was going on in her life, and namely how she tried very hard to do what was known as mental prayer. And we're just moving in to the next few chapters, dwelling places, where she actually talks about mental prayer. She found that very difficult, but she was blessed with experiences of what we would call mystical prayer. And then she had very long periods of dryness, real difficulty in her prayer life that she tells us all about very openly. And she says that even life became burdensome for her because she had this real sense of a pull to wanting to know God more and yet being sort of burdened by all the things that she got wrong. I mean, I don't know if you can relate to Teresa on that, but I can certainly relate to that very much. This sort of, oh, I got it all wrong again, and oh, and all that aspect she lived with for a very, very long time. But what she decided to do was actually give up prayer altogether, and she later realizes that that really wasn't a good thing to do. And any good spiritual director would say, if the going gets tough, then just keep going, and forever for whatever you do, don't give up prayer. So Teresa learned that the hard way, and obviously got back into praying. But then her inner life really started to change in 1554 when she had this sight of the sufferings of Christ that moved her so deeply that she came to a place where she entirely put her trust in Christ. And then she also read St. Augustine's Confessions. And if you remember, there's this amazing passage in St. Augustine where he literally hears the voice of God. He has this incredible experience and he hears the voice of God calling him. And Teresa has the same experience as that. Well, she describes it as having the same experience as that from deep within. So these two sort of external experiences, I suppose, gifted an eye-opening eureka, really was the turning point for her in her life. And I really like it with Teresa, how she sort of holds the two things together. She holds, what's going on in her external life with what's going on in her internal life. So it's not like the two are separate at all. Like, oh, well, you do all our business during the week and then we go to Sunday. Or, we do everything that we have to do during the day and then we'll have our prayer time. She absolutely sees the two of them as one. And it's a lovely, I suppose it's a lovely sort of reminder, really, that our internal world travels with us into our, what we do in everyday life, in our active sort of world. And what we do in our active world, we take into our interior world. So it's a lovely, I think that's very helpful. I find that helpful. So from then on, from this turning point, Teresa started to experience much more profound experiences of prayer, which includes what she describes in the interior castle as passive quiet, and then also the prayer of union. But she had real difficulty with confessors and directors who just refused to see these graces. They thought it was inspired by the devil. And so that must have been really difficult to actually try and find someone who would hear what was going on internally and be a guide for her. Because as we know with Teresa and many of religious at that time, your confessor was the person you went to who would guide you in everything. So if you had a poor confessor, then you were really in dire straits. A bit like Marjorie of Kemp, she had a similar kind of problem. She had a lot of, and actually it can leave real damaging effects on someone's understanding of themselves, but also on their spiritual progress. But her extraordinary experiences continued, and she got this much deeper determination, understanding that she needed to live a much more simpler Carmelite rule with greater perfection. And so that was founded on a new manner of contemplative life within the church. And I think it's in her life where she describes what the kind of Carmelite sort of world was like at that time, and that it was a place where, noble women could go, and that the parlor, which was supposed to be the place where, you were allowed to speak to your loved ones, had become like the gossip center, where people were just sitting there and having a good time. And, so it become really, really lax in its sort of understanding of the spiritual life. And Teresa, was just no more of this. It had to get much more deeper, much more focused on actually the life of prayer and contemplation, and that this was what the church needed at that time. So she therefore started this much stricter way of life, much simpler way of life, stripping back all the kind of, the fancies that people had brought into the convent with them, the sort of lax rules, so that someone could be a noble woman but still have all her contacts within the monastery, so that this was much simpler, much more rigorous, much more bound to silence and prayer. And her first monastery she founded in St. Joseph's in Avila in 1562. And actually, if you go to Avila today, to that little monastery, you can actually see the cell where St. Teresa lived. Which is quite profound, and it's really small, and as I say, it's very simple, just a small cot for a bed and a desk and a cross on the wall, and that's literally it. But she tells us in her life in chapters 32 to 36 actually what it was like to found this. But it became clear that the sisters who were joining her needed to understand, needed a way to catch a vision and understand their own spiritual lives, because otherwise it would be easy to see Teresa as this, great saint, and it was only her who was having these experiences and only her who had this way of life. But that was not Teresa's vision at all. It was a way of life and also an inner life that was accessible to everyone. But what she felt was it needed explaining. She needed to be like the spiritual director to her community. And that's why she wrote in 1565, The Way of Perfection, which was a guide on prayer. And actually, this came out of a request from her sisters. So as I say, it was a much simpler life. The community was only of about 11 nuns who would literally dedicate themselves to the contemplative life according to the Carmelite rule. And they were devoted to unceasing prayer. Now, another turning point for Teresa was in 1567, when she received a visit from Father Rubio, who was the general of the Carmelite order. And he was very much impressed by Teresa and what he saw at St. Joseph's, because if you remember, at this time, there was just St. Joseph's led by Teresa, and then there were all the Carmelites doing their stuff. And so it was a bit of an anomaly. So he came to see her, and obviously he probably wanted to do an inspection. And he was really impressed by what he saw. And he gave permission then to found some monasteries of the same kind, but this was not for women, but for men, for friars. And it was in this way that actually Teresa met the person who later became known as St. John of the Cross. And she convinced him to join her in this work. So a number of these new Carmels, as it was called, were formed, and Teresa describes this in the Book of Foundations. By the time of her death in 1582, there were actually 14 monasteries that were founded in this new rigorous sort of life. But we have to realize this was not easy at all. And Teresa became, and St. John of the Cross became embroiled in the politics and especially the church politics of Spain at the time. Now, I really don't want to get into church politics. I have plenty of that. So if you want to look it up, then please do. And it really is remarkable that Teresa kept her inner life and her experiences of contemplative prayer, mystical prayer, and of union, that actually kept all that going when she was dealing with all these different authorities around her. I think she really is a great icon for our church today about how what is central is the inner prayer, life of prayer, and how she can maneuver then amongst the politics to actually enable, her to actually, get what she needs. So good on her. Good on her is what I say. But in the end, all this kind of traveling and work that she did was really wore her out with fatigue, and that were caused by her last foundation at Burgos in 1582. Yet she was always a person who took obedience very seriously, as we know from this text. And she was given the order by Father Antonio de Jesus to undertake a journey to the Duchess of Alba, but it was very much a kind of vanity trip that she was being asked to do, and yet she still did it. And yet it was that trip that really was the ending of her. And she arrived in Alba and then died in a very small cell on the 4th of October, 1582, thanking God that she had been a daughter of the church. And I think when you read her life and you look at as we're reading her text, I don't think you cannot but admire Teresa. She really was a force for good, but what she had to overcome is really quite phenomenal. And I often feel it must have been this inner strength that she had to actually follow through her vision and her ministry and her mission to serve God and to further this kind of contemplative life, not just for herself, but for different people, many people in the different orders that she set up, and the different monasteries she set up. So, well done, Teresa. You really deserve being a saint. And, if you can hear us now, bravo, I'm on your side. So there's my little preamble about the good old Teresa of Avila. I'm sure you can find much more information in different sources as I say, I'm not an expert, and Teresa, I'm just sort of trying to pick up stuff as I go along. So, but I think that's how she inspires me, and I hope I've managed to impart that a little bit for you, and in your own way, you can find out about her and what it is about her that inspires you. So, I'm going to pull up the oh, I'm gonna put you into breakout rooms first of all, and then what I'm going to do is then put the questions into the chat. So hopefully, and any of you who's having to leave us at this point, I just need to say that sadly. I can't make the meeting next week. The reason being that I've been asked to go with the dean to New York, and hoped that we would be able to do it from New York, but I can't because I've got my day filled with meetings. So I'm very sorry about that. So the next time we'll meet is the 30th of September, which is not next week, but the week after. Anyway, it gives you more time to get on and read Teresa of Avila. So I'll stop twittering on and give you some rooms. So I'll put in about 6 or 7 in each room. So hopefully that will be enough. Okay. So there are rooms. And once you're in them, I'll put the questions up. Okay.